Nineveh did not fall because one army was lucky. It fell because the world that Assyria had terrified for centuries finally learned how to strike back. And among the peoples who marched toward its walls, one name carried the weight of revenge from the mountains of Iran, the Medes. For generations, Assyria had been the empire others feared in silence. Its kings carved victories into palace walls, moved populations across continents, burned rebel cities, and built Nineveh into one of the most powerful capitals the ancient world had ever seen. But empires built on fear always create the same danger. Somewhere, beyond the border, someone is watching, remembering, and waiting. This is Empires Lost in Time, and today we are entering the rise of the Medes, the people who helped bring Nineveh to its final end. If you enjoy cinematic journeys through lost empires, ancient wars, and forgotten powers, subscribe to the channel. Because this is not just the story of a city falling. It is the story of the moment the hunter became the hunted. To understand the Medes, we have to leave the palaces of Assyria and move east toward the Zagros Mountains and the highlands of ancient Iran. That world was different from Mesopotamia. It was harsher, more fragmented, harder to control. Tribes, chiefs, fortified settlements, horsemen, and mountain communities lived beyond the comfortable reach of imperial roads and royal inscriptions. The Assyrians knew these lands well enough to fear and exploit them. They campaigned there, demanded tribute, punished resistance, and tried to keep the mountain peoples divided. But that is the dangerous thing about pressure. It can break a people, yes, but sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes pressure teaches scattered groups that survival depends on becoming something larger, and that is where the Medes begin to matter. They were not born as an empire in the way Assyria was. They rose out of a difficult landscape through alliances, leadership, warfare, and the slow formation of power. Later traditions would speak of Median kings, and one name becomes central to the fall of Assyria. Cyaxares, the ruler who appears in the ancient record as the Medes move from border threat to imperial destroyer. Now, at the same time, Assyria was no longer the untouchable monster it had once been. After the reign of Ashurbanipal, the empire began to weaken from inside. Court politics, succession problems, exhausted armies, angry provinces, and old enemies created cracks in the system. And once those cracks opened, Babylon saw a chance. Nabopolassar rose in the south, and Assyria suddenly had fire at its front and danger at its back. But here's the part that changes everything. Babylon alone had struggled against Assyria for years. The Assyrians had fought back, pushed campaigns away, and survived moments that could have destroyed them. Then the Medes entered the story with force. In 614 BC, they captured Ashur, the ancient sacred heart of Assyria. Not just another city. Ashur was memory, religion, kingship, identity. Imagine what that meant. Before Nineveh fell, Assyria had already seen its old soul wounded. The city of Ashur, the place that carried the name of the god and the empire, was taken and devastated. Nabopolassar arrived too late to take part in that battle, but not too late to understand the opportunity. The Babylonians and the Medes were no longer just enemies of Assyria. They were now partners in its destruction, and so the road led to Nineveh. This was not some forgotten town waiting to be erased. Nineveh was enormous, wealthy, fortified, and symbolic. It held palaces decorated with scenes of conquest. It held royal power. It held the memory of kings who had terrified the Near East. For Assyria's enemies, taking Nineveh was not just a military objective. It was a message to history. In 612 BC, the armies came. The Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Cyaxares joined forces and encamped against the city. Other groups may have been involved too, because the ancient record is fragmented and written through the eyes of victors. But the central picture is clear enough. Nineveh was surrounded, and the empire that had besieged so many cities now found itself trapped behind its own walls. If this story is pulling you in, leave a like and subscribe to Empires Lost in Time. These moments are exactly why ancient history still matters, because the fall of a city like Nineveh is never just about walls breaking. It is about fear changing direction. The siege lasted 3 months. Think about that for a second. 3 months of pressure, hunger, noise, smoke, prayers, rumors, and waiting. Inside the city, people must have understood that something unthinkable was happening. The empire had punished rebels for centuries, but now the rebels were at the gates. The old order was not being challenged anymore. It was being dismantled. And then Nineveh broke. The ancient chronicle says the attackers inflicted a great defeat, carried off vast booty from the city and temple, and turned the city into a ruin heap. The Assyrian king Sin-shar-ishkun died during the catastrophe. The palaces that had once displayed Assyrian victory became scenes of collapse. The capital that had projected power across the Near East was now burning inside its own legend. There is a brutal irony here. Assyria had mastered the language of terror. Its kings wanted defeated peoples to see what happened to anyone who resisted. But when Nineveh fell, that same language was turned against Assyria. The destruction was not random. It was political, emotional, and symbolic. The empire's enemies were not only taking a city, they were answering generations of domination. Still, history is rarely as clean as a dramatic ending. The fall of Nineveh did not mean every Assyrian soldier vanished that night. Survivors regrouped farther west, especially around Haran, and the struggle continued for a few more years. But the center was gone. The great imperial capital had fallen, and once that happened, Assyria could no longer pretend the world had not changed. For the Medes, this was the moment their name entered the great turning point of the age. They had come from the highlands and helped bring down the most feared empire of the Near East. Yet they remain strangely shadowed in history. We do not have Median royal archives like we have Assyrian tablets. We see them mostly through the words of others, Babylonians, Greeks, Assyrians, and later traditions. And maybe that makes them even more fascinating. The Medes changed history, but they did not leave history in their own voice. They appear like a storm coming down from the mountains, powerful enough to break Assyria, but distant enough that we still argue over the shape of their kingdom, the depth of their organization, and the real scale of their empire. After Nineveh, Babylon rose. The Neo-Babylonian Empire inherited much of the space Assyria had once dominated, and soon Nebuchadnezzar II would turn Babylon into the new imperial center of the region. But the Medes remained a force in the east, part of the political world that would eventually lead toward the rise of Persia. One empire had fallen, but the age of empires was far from over. And Nineveh? It never returned to what it had been. People did continue to live in and around the site in later periods, but the imperial city was gone. Its palaces were buried. Its sculptures slept under earth. Its library tablets, hardened by disaster and rediscovered centuries later, became one of the reasons we can still hear Mesopotamia speaking across time. That is the strange legacy of Nineveh. The city fell in violence, but the ruins preserved memory. The Assyrians wanted their victories carved forever into stone, and in a way, they got what they wanted. But they also preserved the evidence of their own ending. The walls, the tablets, the burned rooms, the buried palaces, all of it became testimony. So when we speak of the rise of the Medes, we are not just speaking about one people defeating another. We are speaking about a reversal. Mountain peoples once pressured by Assyrian power became part of the force that ended Assyria's greatest city. The empire that had written fear into the ancient world finally met enemies who had learned how to write back. And that is why the fall of Nineveh still feels so cinematic. It has everything history uses when it wants to remind us that no power is permanent. A proud capital, an exhausted empire, enemies at the edge of the map, alliances formed in desperation, 3 months of siege, and then silence where the center of the world used to be. Nineveh fell. Assyria's shadow broke. The Medes rose from the mountains and helped close one of the most violent chapters of the ancient Near East. And if you want to continue this journey through lost empires, forgotten cities, and civilizations that disappeared into time, watch the next documentary from Empires Lost in Time. Because every ruin has a final day, and some final days change the world.